Welcome back to History 3011. Today we're exploring a question that has divided Americans for generations. The American Civil War ended in 1865. The guns fell silent. The armies went home. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. So why, more than 160 years later, does America still argue about the Civil War? The answer isn't found only on the battlefield. It's found in memory, on April 9th, 1865. Inside a modest home in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, two generals met face to face: Union General Ulysses S. Grant, Confederate General Robert E. Lee. After 4 years of devastating war, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The Civil War was effectively over. Outside, Union soldiers celebrated. Some embraced, some cried, others simply stood in silence. The fighting had finally ended. It had been the deadliest conflict in American history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had lost their lives. Entire towns had been destroyed. Families had been divided. No corner of the nation had escaped its impact. Across the South, something even more extraordinary was happening. Millions of formerly enslaved African Americans were experiencing freedom for the first time. Families searched for loved ones who had been separated for years. Parents dreamed of sending their children to school. Churches filled with prayers of hope. For many, it felt like a completely new beginning. But freedom alone could not erase generations of suffering, nor could it instantly rebuild a nation that had nearly torn itself apart. The South lay in ruins. Railroads had been destroyed. Cities had burned. Farms struggled to recover. The economy had collapsed. America faced a question unlike any in its history. How do you rebuild a nation when its people no longer trust one another? Then, only days after the war ended, another tragedy struck. On April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The man who had guided the nation through its greatest crisis was gone. The country mourned together. Newspapers carried shocking headlines. Church bells rang across cities and towns. Millions wondered what would happen next. Without Lincoln, who would reunite the country? Who would decide what peace should look like? As the weeks passed, the battlefield slowly grew quiet. Grass began covering the trenches. Cannons rusted beneath the rain. The smoke disappeared. But something invisible remained. The memories. For every family, the Civil War meant something different. For some, it was the story of preserving the Union. For others, it was the end of slavery. For many, it was simply the loss of fathers, brothers, sons, and friends. The war had ended, but the story of the war had only just begun, because the greatest battle would no longer be fought with rifles or cannons. It would be fought over a single question. What should America remember? Rebuilding roads and cities would take years, but rebuilding trust would take generations. In the next chapter, America enters Reconstruction, a bold attempt to reunite a broken nation that would change its future forever. The Civil War was over, but rebuilding America would prove far more difficult than winning the war itself. The nation now faced an enormous challenge. How do you reunite millions of people who had spent 4 years fighting one another? This period became known as Reconstruction. It was one of the most ambitious efforts in American history. The federal government began rebuilding the South. Railroads were repaired, courthouses reopened, schools were established. Entire communities started over almost from nothing. for nearly 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans. Life was entering a completely new chapter. The Freedmen's Bureau helped provide food, medical care, education, and legal assistance. Across the South, new schools opened their doors. For many children, it was the first opportunity in their lives to learn to read and write. Education quickly became a symbol of hope. Families believed that knowledge could build a better future than the one they had left behind. At the same time, the Constitution was changing. New amendments expanded citizenship and voting rights. For the first time, many African American men participated in elections and held public office. State legislatures that had once excluded them now included black representatives helping shape new laws. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that America might truly become the nation Lincoln had imagined. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Across parts of the South, resistance began to grow. Some former Confederates refused to accept Reconstruction policies. Secret organizations formed. Acts of intimidation spread through many communities. Fear returned to places that had only recently begun to recover from war. Families locked their doors before nightfall. Teachers, community leaders, and local officials often faced threats simply for trying to build a different future. To maintain order, federal troops remained stationed across much of the South. Their presence helped enforce new laws and protect elections. Yet political disagreements continued to deepen. In Washington, arguments over Reconstruction became increasingly intense. Some leaders believed the federal government should continue protecting civil rights. Others argued that the Southern states should regain greater control over their own affairs. The debate would shape American politics for decades. By the late 1870s, many Reconstruction programs began to lose political support. Federal troops gradually withdrew. Local governments once again took responsibility for governing much of the South. The period of Reconstruction was coming to an end. Its achievements had changed the nation forever, but many of its promises remained unfinished. The war had been won. Freedom had been declared. New rights had been written into law. Yet one important question still remained unanswered. How would future generations remember the Civil War? Would they remember it primarily as a fight to preserve the Union, a struggle over slavery, a story of shared sacrifice, or something entirely different? Because while America rebuilt its cities, it was also beginning to rebuild its memory, and memory can be just as powerful as history itself. As Reconstruction faded into history, a news story about the Civil War began to spread across America. It would appear in monuments, newspapers, classrooms, and history books, and influence generations to come. Reconstruction had ended. The battlefields were quiet. The cities were rebuilding. But another battle had quietly begun. A battle over memory. Unlike wars fought with rifles and cannons, this one would be fought with speeches, books, newspapers, and monuments. Across the South, former Confederate veterans began gathering for reunions. Old soldiers who had once faced Union armies now sat together beneath oak trees, remembering the friends they had lost. Many wanted to honor sacrifice. Many wanted to preserve their personal memories of the war. At the same time, writers, journalists, and public speakers began telling a particular version of the Civil War. Over the following decades, this interpretation became widely known as the Lost Cause narrative. Supporters of this interpretation often emphasized courage, military honor, and loyalty to one's homeland. Many portrayed Confederate soldiers as brave men fighting for their states and communities. At the same time, historians have noted that this narrative often gave much less attention to slavery, emancipation, and the experiences of millions of formerly enslaved African Americans. As this interpretation spread, it appeared everywhere. Newspapers published stories celebrating Confederate generals. Publishers released books presenting the war through this new perspective. Veterans organizations sponsored public ceremonies. School textbooks in many communities began teaching versions of history that reflected these changing memories. A new generation was growing up. Many children had never witnessed the Civil War. Everything they knew came from books, teachers, newspapers, and the stories told by their parents and grandparents. At the same time, across many southern towns, large memorials began appearing in public squares. Bronze statues, stone monuments, historic plaques. For some Americans, these monuments honored family members who had served during the war. For others, they represented painful reminders of slavery and division. The same monument could carry completely different meanings depending on who was looking at it. Even veterans remembered the conflict differently. Union soldiers often viewed the war as a struggle to preserve the United States and end slavery. Many former Confederates remembered it as a defense of their homes, their communities, and their way of life. Neither memory erased the suffering experienced by ordinary families on both sides. History had become more than a collection of dates. It had become a story people told about themselves. Inside libraries, new generations of historians continued studying original letters, military records, government documents, and personal diaries. With every new discovery, questions became more complex. History was no longer simply asking, "What happened?" It was also asking, "Why do different people remember the same events so differently?" Because memory is never frozen in time. Each generation asks new questions, finds new evidence, and sees familiar events through a different lens. The Civil War had ended decades earlier, but America's conversation about its meaning was only becoming more complicated. As the 20th century began, the memory of the Civil War continued to shape American society. The next great struggle would not be fought on battlefields, but in classrooms, courtrooms, churches, and city streets, as a new generation demanded that the promises of freedom and equality be fully realized. As the 20th century unfolded, America entered a new era. Factories expanded, cities grew, technology transformed everyday life. But beneath that progress, old questions about freedom, equality, and justice had never completely disappeared. For many Americans, the promises made after the Civil War still felt unfinished. Across much of the South, segregation had become part of daily life. Many public spaces, schools, transportation systems, and other facilities were separated by law or local practice. For millions of African Americans, equal rights guaranteed on paper were often difficult to exercise in reality. Voting could involve significant barriers. Educational opportunities varied widely from one community to another. Economic opportunities remained unequal. Yet despite these challenges, communities continued to build schools, churches, businesses, and organizations that strengthened hope for future generations. Teachers worked tirelessly inside small classrooms. Parents encouraged their children to pursue education. Churches became more than places of worship. They became centers of leadership, learning, and community organization. At the same time, the nation itself continued changing. New immigrants arrived, industries expanded, American cities became larger than ever before. Yet the memory of the Civil War remained visible. Old battlefields became historic parks. Veterans gathered for reunions. Union and Confederate soldiers, now elderly men, sometimes shook hands where they had once fought one another. Those images inspired many Americans. They symbolized reconciliation. But historians would later ask an important question. Had the nation focused so much on reconciliation that it sometimes overlooked the unfinished work of equality? As decades passed, children learned about the Civil War in schools. Families visited monuments. Communities honored military service. Each generation inherited not only the history, but also the memory of that history. And memory is never simple. It changes with time. It changes as new evidence is discovered. It changes as society asks different questions. The Civil War was becoming more distant, but its legacy remained remarkably close. By the middle of the 20th century, a new generation of Americans was ready to ask difficult questions. Questions about citizenship, questions about democracy, questions about equality before the law. They believed the ideals written into the Constitution should apply to every American. The struggle would no longer be fought with armies. It would be fought through peaceful protest, court decisions, public speeches, and ordinary citizens willing to stand for what they believed was right. The next chapter in America's story was about to begin. Nearly 100 years after the Civil War ended, a new movement would challenge America to live up to its founding ideals. The Civil Rights Movement would once again force the nation to confront the legacy of its past and decide what freedom truly meant for everyone. Nearly 100 years had passed since the Civil War ended. America had changed dramatically. But one question remained. Had the nation truly fulfilled the promises made after 1865? For millions of African Americans, the answer was still no. Then, on December 1st, 1955, an ordinary woman made an extraordinary decision. Her name was Rosa Parks. She boarded a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. When she was ordered to give up her seat, she quietly refused. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply remained seated. That single act of courage sparked one of the most important movements in American history. Soon, thousands of people across Montgomery stopped riding city buses. Instead, they walked every day to work, to school, to church. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted more than a year. It demonstrated that peaceful protest could become a powerful force for change. During that movement, a young pastor began inspiring millions of Americans. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His message was simple: justice without violence, courage without hatred, hope without surrender. Across the country, peaceful demonstrations grew larger. Students organized sit-ins, families joined marches, communities demanded equal rights under the law. One of the defining moments came in 1965. The city of Selma, Alabama. Hundreds of peaceful demonstrators gathered to march in support of voting rights. As they approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the nation watched. Images from Selma were broadcast across America. Millions of people who had never visited Alabama suddenly saw the struggle unfold before their eyes. the movement continued growing. Later that same decade, Congress debated historic civil rights legislation. Lawmakers spent months discussing bills that would reshape American society. Finally, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. The following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law. Together, these landmark laws represented some of the most significant civil rights legislation in American history. Across the nation, more citizens were able to participate in elections. Schools continued integrating. Opportunities gradually expanded. The changes did not erase every challenge, but they marked an important turning point. For many historians, the civil rights movement represented an effort to continue work that had begun during Reconstruction nearly a century earlier. The conversation about freedom, citizenship, and equality had not ended after the Civil War. It had simply entered a new chapter. In classrooms across America, students now studied Abraham Lincoln alongside Martin Luther King Jr., two leaders separated by 100 years, yet connected by a shared belief that the nation could move closer to its founding ideals. The Civil War had changed America. The Civil Rights Movement challenged America to continue changing. And together, they shaped the country we know today. The battles had ended. The laws had changed. But one final question remained. How should America remember the Civil War today? The answer continues to evolve with every new generation. More than 160 years have passed since the first shots of the Civil War were fired. The soldiers are gone. The battlefields are quiet. The smoke has long disappeared. But the conversation continues. Today, places like Gettysburg are no longer battlefields. They have become classrooms without walls. Every year, millions of visitors walk the same ground where soldiers once fought. Park rangers tell stories. Families read the names carved into monuments. Students stand in silence where history was made. These places no longer ask people to choose sides. They ask people to remember. Across America, museums carefully preserve uniforms, letters, photographs, and personal diaries. Every artifact reminds us that history is not only about famous generals or presidents. It is also about ordinary people. Farmers, teachers, mothers, children, soldiers who never returned home. Historians continue studying original documents. New letters are discovered. Old records are re-examined. Questions once considered settled are asked again. That is how history works. It is never frozen. It grows as new evidence emerges, and as each generation asks new questions. In classrooms across America, students now compare different historical sources. They learn that history is rarely simple. Two eyewitnesses can describe the same event differently. A newspaper from 1865 may tell one story. A personal diary may tell another. Neither should be accepted without careful examination. That is why studying history requires curiosity, evidence, and an open mind. The Civil War also lives on through memorials. Some Americans see monuments as places to honor ancestors and remember sacrifice. Others believe certain monuments should be reconsidered because of what they represent. These discussions continue in communities across the country, regardless of individual opinions. One fact remains unchanged. The Civil War profoundly shaped the United States. It preserved the Union. It ended slavery. It transformed the Constitution. and it changed the meaning of American citizenship forever. History does not belong to one generation. It belongs to all of us. Our responsibility is not to erase the past, nor to romanticize it, but to understand it honestly, to study original evidence, to listen to different perspectives, and to remember the human cost behind every historical event. When visitors stand quietly at Gettysburg, walk through Arlington National Cemetery, or read Abraham Lincoln's words at the Lincoln Memorial, they are reminded of something larger than politics. They are reminded that democracy has always required sacrifice, that freedom has never been guaranteed, and that unity is something every generation must continue building. The Civil War officially ended in 1865, but its legacy continues to influence American history, politics, culture, and national identity. Perhaps that is why people still discuss it today. Not because the war continues, but because its lessons still matter. History is not simply about remembering the past. It is about understanding the present and making wiser decisions for the future. Thank you for watching History 3011. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more cinematic documentaries exploring the events that shape America and the world, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey through history. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring the stories that change the world.